In 1984, a boy disappeared from Crater Lake. No body, no footprints, just a single torn strap from his backpack found near the edge of the ridge. Years passed. Then a ranger swore he saw someone tall, unmoving, just standing there in the fog. That was the last time anyone reported seeing the ghost in the woods. And it was the year the disappearances stopped. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. I'm Rachel Weller. I've been with the National Park Service for almost 20 years now, most of them in Southern Oregon. I was born not far from here in Grants Pass, and I used to think of the forest as a kind of second mother. Quiet, protective, unshakable. When I was younger, I thought if you followed the rules, marked your trail packed in and out, respected the land, you'd be safe. But rules only work when everything's playing by them. I wasn't always stationed at Crater Lake. For a long time, I avoided it. Too many ghosts. My younger brother Daniel disappeared here in the summer of '84. He was 14, smart, restless. He told our mom he was going to spend the afternoon sketching near the West Ridge Trail. He never came back. Back then, I was just a teenager myself. I remember the flyers, the search dogs, the lines of volunteers combing through pine and shale and silence. I remember the way the woods never answered back. And I remember something else, that long after the official search ended, people still saw things, heard things they didn't always report. I'd been avoiding that silence for most of my life. Until last year, when the new district ranger Miles Keating asked if I'd consider transferring to Crater Rim. Said they needed someone who knew the area. I think he also knew about Daniel. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. The job itself was steady trail maintenance, fire watch, keeping an eye on visitors. Miles and I made a good team. He's ex-Forest Service, methodical fare. We kept a routine. Nothing strange for the first few months. Until a report came in that fall. An old trail map had surfaced in a private collection, one that showed a marked gorge no longer listed on any of the park's official guides. Bare Needle Hollow. I'd never heard of it. But when I laid it over a map of known disappearances from the 70s and 80s, Daniel's included it sat like a hub in a wheel. Every name curved around it. Miles leaned over my desk and pointed to the center of the ridge. "Right there," he said. "That's where the forest ends." I looked at him. "No," I said. "That's where it begins." The next morning we filed an off-books recon plan. 2 staff, light gear, private hike. Just to check the terrain, just to see. But that night before we even set out, my phone rang. It was Don Weaver, retired tower ranger, said he'd heard we were sniffing around the hollow. Then he said something I still can't explain. "I saw your brother, long after he vanished, and the line went dead. Don Weaver didn't call back. I tried twice that night, once from the ranger station and once from my own landline, but both went to voicemail." Miles was already halfway through his second cup of coffee when I got in the next morning, like he hadn't slept either. I told him what Don said about seeing Daniel, and for a moment he just stared at me. Then he nodded once, slow and even. "We'll go see him," he said. "Pack light." By noon we were on the road heading south out of Crater Rim. Don lived just past the outskirts of Grants Pass in a worn little trailer parked beneath an old pine that looked like it had stood there long before the road ever came through. He wasn't surprised to see us. Just opened the door, nodded, and motioned for us to sit outside under a folding awning that sagged a little in the middle. There were 2 enamel mugs already set out on the table and a coffee pot that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. I hadn't seen Don in years, decades, really. Last time was at the memorial service the park held after Daniel was declared presumed dead. Don had kept his distance then. He didn't now. When I said my brother's name, his eyes sharpened. "You're talking about the ghost," he said, pouring coffee. "Clemens." Miles leaned forward. "You saw him?" Don nodded once. Fall of '87. Didn't go public. Didn't see the point. He looked out toward the road like he was watching something far off. Windmere Tower just past dusk. Fog rolling in from the basin. I was doing a routine scan with field glasses. Saw movement near the old lava shelf. His hand curled around the mug. Tall man, long coat, hood up maybe. He wasn't walking. He was just standing there facing me. "Did you try to contact him?" I asked. Don shook his head. "Didn't have to." He didn't move, not once. Stared straight at the tower for a good 15 minutes. Then the fog came in heavier and he vanished. I asked if he could see his face. Don paused. "Yeah," he said quietly. Beard, weathered. Looked like he hadn't been indoors in years. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and stepped back into the trailer. When he came out, he held a small wooden box. Inside were scraps of memorabilia, pressed wildflowers, a broken compass, his old tower badge, and a weather log pages, yellowed but legible. He flipped to one marked October 3rd, 1987. The entry was short, 6:22 p.m., visual contact, unidentified male, stationary, fog 85%, coordinates logged. He tapped the page. Nobody followed up. He set the book down. After that night, I started noticing things. Stacked rocks, scratches on stones, patterns like runes. And one morning, a dead raccoon on the step. No blood. Just placed. I felt the chill climb into me then. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. Like part of me already knew where this was leading. Miles asked quietly, "Did you ever feel like he was watching you?" Don didn't answer right away. He just stared at the tree line. "Always," he said. When we left, he touched my arm. His hand was rough like bark. If your brother crossed paths with him, he said he wouldn't have stood a chance. We drove back in silence. I went straight to the ranger station and pulled the original incident maps from the archive cabinet. Then I laid Don's coordinates over the known disappearance sites, Daniel's, Susan's, the Allen twins. They curved in a loose crescent along the western ridge, all radiating outward from a narrow cut in the rock labeled only on the oldest survey maps, Bare Needle Hollow. I'd never heard it spoken aloud. It had been removed from modern trail guides decades ago, listed as unstable due to landslides. But it was there plain as day. A natural bowl hidden from above, unreachable from below, unless you knew the old fire break path maintenance crews had used before the reroute. Miles stood beside me, tracing the curve with his finger. "That's your cluster," he said. I nodded. That's where Clemens disappeared too. 2 days later, we took a team in. Just the two of us and a pair of junior rangers. We didn't tell them why. Just called it an off-season inspection. The trail to Bare Needle Hollow had been mostly swallowed by time overgrown and buckled with shale. The frost made the ground slick. Fir and spruce pressed in close, turning the air still and heavy. Even the birds were quiet. We moved slow, careful listening. At the top of the final incline, Miles raised his binoculars. "There," he said, pointing past a split cedar. The land opened suddenly, a sheer drop into a narrow gorge flanked by stone walls. The terrain leveled briefly, just enough for something to hide. We descended single-file boots, crunching frost. Ivy covered everything. But under the bramble and lichen, we found it. A structure wooden collapsed, nearly eaten by the land. A cabin. Hand-hewn logs. A rusted hinge still clung to a doorframe that no longer stood. I brushed the ivy from the threshold. Carved deep into the wood, H.C. Miles said it first. Howard Clemens. Inside, the air was damp and stale. The roof had long since given way. Rodents had pulled the bedding into nests. But in the far corner, behind a natural rock wall, Miles pried up a loose floorboard and found a sealed metal box. Inside was a notebook, pages dry but brittle, a knife worn down to a sliver, and a photograph faded but clear, a woman smiling beside a pickup truck. On the back, Margaret, 1952. I opened the notebook. The handwriting was sharp clean. No names. No dates, just entries. Descriptions of hikers, their gear, their routes, stayed out of sight. Fire brings them. Must only use smoke at night. It read like surveillance, like avoidance. Then near the end, one entry stopped me. The boy asked me my name. I said nothing. He stood still. He looked like he knew me. I turned away. I looked at Miles. That could be Daniel. He didn't answer, just folded the notebook and sealed it back in the box. As we turned to leave, one of the younger rangers called out. He'd found something farther down the ravine. A flash of color half buried in pine needles and dirt. Bright orange. A scrap of nylon. I knew that color. I'd helped Mom pick that pack out for Daniel the week before he vanished. We hiked down, careful now. The slope was steep, the ground loose beneath our feet. Below, we found what was left of the pack frame, crushed contents scattered. A cracked compass, a waterlogged notebook, and a film canister miraculously sealed. Miles held it in his palm like it might vanish. The air felt different then. Heavy. We weren't chasing shadows anymore. We were standing in the last place Daniel had been. And something told me he hadn't been alone. Not out here. Not in this hollow. Not ever again. The light was already starting to drop by the time we reached the floor of the ravine, but none of us wanted to leave, not after finding the nylon scrap. Miles and I worked slowly, clearing debris by hand, while the younger rangers fanned out to search the nearby rocks and undergrowth. I kept my eyes low, sweeping through needles and shale with the side of my boot until my fingers caught the corner of something harder buried in the dirt. A bent aluminum frame, fractured but unmistakably part of a backpack, rested in a shallow bed of soil and pine duff. Near it, a rusted compass lay half-split under pressure. A leather-bound notebook, waterlogged and swollen, had lodged between stones. Miles handled it carefully, nodding at the initials I knew would be inside. I held the notebook in my hands. The spine was warped, but the weight of it made it real. It was his, Daniel's. There was no doubt. Miles opened the film canister he'd tucked into his jacket pocket earlier and showed it to me. The roll inside was intact, protected from the elements for more than a decade. He said they'd get it to the lab in Medford by morning. Then someone else called out again. This time from a little farther uphill, tucked behind a low rise where the trees thickened around a rough outcrop. Miles and I climbed carefully, the terrain uneven and still slick from morning frost. At the edge of a thicket, we saw it stones stacked deliberately in a tight arc around a depression in the ground. Not natural. Beneath them, scattered bones too small to be human, maybe raccoon or fox laid out in mirrored pairs. But what stopped me was what lay beside them, a strip of waxed cloth folded around something stiff. I pulled it back. Inside was a torn journal page, just one, and the writing was unmistakably Daniel's. He told me he used to be someone else. Said the world was too loud, that he came here to forget, but the memories still follow him through the trees. He said I was the first person he'd spoken to in years. He's afraid of what he's become. I read it twice. Then I read it again, this time aloud. Nobody spoke. The younger ranger to my left stepped back without meaning to. We pressed farther down the ravine after that. It narrowed the slope, growing steeper with every few yards. Roots jutted like knuckles from the soil, and the silence grew thicker, heavier. We passed through a natural bottleneck where two large boulders created a kind of choke point in the terrain, and on the other side the woods opened into a wide, shallow clearing, a place the forest had not fully reclaimed. That was where we found it. A grave. Shallow. At first glance, no more than a rise in the soil ringed with small stones. The marker had long since rotted, but the shape was unmistakable. Something had been buried here. Miles didn't speak. He just knelt beside it, brushing away the surface carefully with his glove. I stood a few feet back watching. We didn't have shovels. We used our hands working through the soft layer of forest loam until the soil turned darker and more compacted. The grave wasn't deep, 2 feet at most. It didn't need to be, not for what was inside. A coat, heavy wool, black, mostly intact except for the collar which had decayed away to loose threads. Below it, bone, compact, human. The skeleton had curled slightly from time and pressure. Not much left but ribs and the curve of the skull, but still enough. Around the neck, caught in the folds of the coat, was a length of cord, and on the cord a rusted military dog tag. Miles brushed away the last of the dirt and read it aloud. Clemens H. U.S. Army, 1944. I stepped back. My arms were trembling, but not from the cold. So that was it. Clemens had died out here. Not long after Daniel vanished, which meant the man Don saw in the fog, he wasn't hallucinating. He saw someone, and it wasn't Clemens. Miles stood slowly. His voice was flat. If Clemens is here, then someone else. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We both turned, looking back toward the path we'd come from, toward the broken cabin. The firebreak trail, the woods still crouched behind us like a held breath. The rest of the hike out was quiet. At the ranger station, we cataloged everything, tagged and bagged every item with gloves and proper labels. I laid Daniel's notebook out to dry in the archive room and checked the canister again, sealing it in a padded bag for transport. I couldn't sleep that night. Around 3:00 a.m., I went back to the station alone and sat with the logbooks. One after another, I flipped through ranger incident records from 1980 to 1984. I cross-referenced every disappearance with the days Clemens was on duty. That's when I found it. 2 more hikers, young men, both solo, both in their 20s, had vanished near the western rim before Daniel. One of them, a drifter from California named Michael Lantry, had been seen last by a ranger. The name in the margin, H. Clemens. Provided water. Warned about unstable cliffs. That's all it said. But I knew what it meant. That night, I called Miles. I told him everything. I told him I didn't think Daniel was taken by Clemens. I think Daniel met someone else, someone who came after, someone who moved into the space Clemens left behind. Miles didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You think it was one of the missing?" I said I didn't know. But it felt possible. That one of them never left the woods, that he stayed, took over the hollow, watched the ridge the way Clemens once did. Miles was quiet again, then finally said, "That would explain the timing. The disappearances stopped after 87. Maybe not because someone was caught. Maybe because whoever was doing it didn't need to anymore." The next day we went back. We brought more rangers. We expanded the search zone north of the hollow and found more signs. Small traps, a tarp shelter collapsed under rot. A sealed tin tucked beneath a stone inside it, bones of birds and rodents, feathers and carved tokens, tiny human figures all with a single slash across the face. I turned them over in my hand and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't survival. It wasn't hunting. It was something else. Then the radio crackled. One of the rangers had found a marker stone circle central post. Miles and I made our way there quickly. When we arrived, I saw it initials carved again and again into the wood of the post. Not just once, dozens of times. DW, overlapping, uneven, deep and shallow. I didn't say anything for a long while, just stared. Miles did too. "He came back here," I said finally. "Over and over." Miles touched the edge of the post. Whoever did this wasn't marking time. They were trying to make sure he wouldn't be forgotten. I turned and looked back toward the woods. The silence between the trees felt different now. Heavier. Closer. Like something was listening. watching, waiting for us to move again. We marked the post with a GPS tag and flagged the site for later documentation, but neither of us moved for a long time. The carvings, the repetition of Daniel's initials, left a weight that didn't lift when we turned our backs to the clearing. Miles didn't say much on the hike out. Neither did I. Something had shifted. We'd come in thinking this was about Clemens, his ghost, his legacy, his disappearance, but now it felt like he'd only been the first chapter. Someone else had been watching that ridge after he was gone. Someone younger. Someone different. And whoever it was, they wanted Daniel remembered. Or maybe marked. That night, I sat with Daniel's recovered notebook in the archive room, letting the soft hum of the overhead lights settle into my ears. The pages were warped and stained, but a few entries had survived. One caught my eye not because of what it said, but how it was written. He watched me from across the ridge again. Said nothing. He knew I had a sister. I never told him. I read it 3 times. That line stuck with me. I never told him. Daniel wasn't careless. He'd been a quiet kid, but not naive. If someone knew about me, it wasn't from idle conversation. That detail my existence meant he'd been watched, longer than he realized. I turned another page. Not Clemens. Different eyes. Younger. Stillness was different. That sentence chilled me more than the rest. I didn't know what he meant by stillness was different, but I believed him. Whoever Daniel saw wasn't the same man Don Weaver had described. That stillness, the one Don watched from the tower, the figure locked in fog, it wasn't youthful. It was fixed, maybe even deliberate. This sounded restless. That's when I started pulling old logs. Park incidents from 1980 to 1984, back when Daniel's disappearance hadn't yet been the headline. I cross-referenced missing persons ranger citations, anything off-book. Most led nowhere. False sightings overdue hikers who turned up at a ranger station a day late and sunburned, but 2 names stood out. One was familiar already, Daniel. The second I hadn't heard in years. Michael Lantry, 26, California plates, reported last seen near the South Rim entrance in the spring of '81. Officially marked as presumed lost to terrain, but tucked in the margins of an incident card was a short note from Clemens. Said he gave water to a lone hiker near Bare Needle Hollow, warned him about loose shale on the western slopes. That was the last confirmed contact. Nothing after. I picked up the phone and called Miles. It was close to midnight. I asked him to meet me at the station, and he didn't hesitate. When I laid it all out, he didn't argue. He just stared at the wall map with a kind of slow, quiet recognition. "You're thinking Lantry stayed," he said. I nodded. Maybe followed Clemens. Maybe replaced him. Or maybe he killed him, Miles said. Not cruel, just calm. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Either way, the result was the same. Daniel had crossed paths with someone in those woods, someone who wasn't Clemens, and that person had stayed long after the official search parties packed up and went home. The next morning, we returned to Bare Needle Hollow. This time, we weren't alone. We brought 3 additional staff, another set of radios, and marked boundaries for a grid sweep. We didn't explain everything, just said we were following up on new evidence. We started along the northern rim, near where the scrap of Daniel's backpack had been found. By late afternoon, we'd logged more sites. Traps small, clever, decayed. Animal remains arranged beneath stone shelves. A tarp shelter half collapsed, now more moss than fabric. But it was the tin that unsettled me most. Tucked beneath a slab of quartz, buried beneath what looked like decades of accumulated leaf litter, it held what I can only describe as a shrine. Feathers, small bones, and wooden figures, each hand-carved, each humanoid, and each slashed across the face with a single clean line. I turned them over slowly, one by one. There were 7 total. 6 were rough-crewed. 1 was different. Slightly taller, smoother, unmarked. I didn't say anything at first, just passed it silently to Miles. He turned it over in his palm. "This one doesn't have the cut," he said. I nodded. "Maybe that's Daniel." We didn't speculate further. There wasn't anything to gain from guessing. But deep down I felt it the way that last figurine was shaped, how the wood had been polished by hand. It wasn't like the others. It hadn't been meant to be erased. We pressed farther northward along a ridge where we hadn't yet searched. That's when the radio crackled. One of our rangers had found something in a small clearing beyond the trees, stones, and a ring, another post at the center. I felt it before I saw it. The clearing had an energy I can't describe, still but not peaceful, like the woods themselves were waiting. The post was weathered, the wood dark and cracked. The carvings were everywhere, DW over and over again, some so shallow they'd faded to ghost lines, others dug so deep the wood splintered around them. Miles crouched beside it, running his hand across the grooves. "This isn't just grief," he said. "This is ritual." We flagged the site and began a perimeter check. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. On the other side of the post were additional carvings, not letters this time. Symbols, a spiral, a square, a human shape with no face, childlike in form but precise. I took a photo. Then another, and another. Miles stood next to me, arms folded, breathing shallow. "This isn't trail marker stuff," he said. "This was made to mean something." I called Dr. Lyndon Nash, a park anthropologist I trusted, and asked her to meet us in the morning. When she arrived, she took one look at the post and changed. Her curiosity drained into something more measured. "These aren't indigenous," she said. "Not petroglyphs. Not ritual symbols I've seen in historical references. This is invented. By one person, possibly over years." She pointed to the spiral. "This usually means return, or entrapment, a closed loop, the square shelter, structure, the figure." She trailed off, tracing the faceless form. This could be a warning, or a confession. Her voice was calm but not casual. It reminded me of someone walking along the edge of a frozen lake. Later that afternoon, just beyond the clearing, we found another formation, rocks set in an arch over a shallow pit. Inside, more bones. Not human. But they were arranged in mirrored pairs again. Always one large, one small. Always facing each other. It was mimicry. Or replacement. A pattern not made by accident. Miles knelt beside them. She was copying something he said. Or someone. I didn't reply. I was still holding the figurine. The one with no slash. No identity removed. Just a small piece of wood shaped by time and hands and silence. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I was starting to understand the kind of person who would have made it. And I knew Daniel had met him. That night, I couldn't bring myself to lock the archive room. I sat at the long table staring at the figurines arranged in a line across the folder boxes. 6 slashed, 1 spared. I don't know how long I was there before the phone rang. Miles answered. His face changed as he listened, then motioned for me to follow him. The film lab had developed Daniel's role. One photo stood out. A small campfire, a tent, and just beyond the firelight, caught in the edge of the frame, a figure, partially obscured, watching. I leaned forward. Only one eye caught the flash, but the shape was clear. That wasn't Daniel. I knew that face. Or at least the scar. Miles looked at me. "We might have a match." I didn't speak. Not yet. Because even before we had a name, I could feel it in my chest. The second shadow had a face now, and he had been there all along, watching, waiting. The photograph was grainy but clear enough. In the corner near the tree line, just past Daniel's tent, a figure stood watching. Only part of the face showed one shoulder, half of the jawline, a portion of the cheekbone, but there was no mistaking the detail that stood out most. A scar, long and diagonal, cutting across the right cheek. Miles and I stared at it in silence as the tech adjusted the contrast and zoomed in frame by frame. The man wasn't Daniel. He was older, broader in the chest, bundled in layers of worn fabric that looked handmade or scavenged. The scar was fresh back then, probably newer than it looked now. The technician, Elias Harper, marked the coordinates and asked if we wanted him to run it through local and national databases. I told him we'd already started that part ourselves. Back at the ranger station, I pulled out Daniel's notebook again. There was one entry I hadn't fully understood until now. He told me he used to be someone else. The world was too loud. He came here to forget. I traced the line with my finger, then turned back to the arrest logs I'd flagged from earlier in the week. There it was again. Michael Lantry, 26 at the time of his disappearance, arrested in Jackson County for illegal camping and property damage. Charges dropped. No fixed address. Last seen headed north toward Crater Lake. That was in 1980, 4 years before Daniel vanished. I pulled up the mugshot. Same shape to the face. Same frame. The scar wasn't there in the photo, but the outline matched. Miles walked in with coffee and stood behind me. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he nodded at the screen. That's him. He didn't die out there, I said. He stayed. Miles exhaled. Maybe Clemens taught him. Or maybe he took over after Clemens was gone. Or maybe it was both, I said. A handoff, intentional or not. That afternoon we headed back to Bare Needle Hollow. The woods had changed since the first time I set foot there years ago. Or maybe it was me. We hiked in through a side route we hadn't checked before, following a dry creek bed from an old ranger trail marked on pre-70s maps. The trees were denser here, the air closer. No trail markers, no sound of other teams. Just the wind in the canopy and the steady rhythm of our boots. About 3 hours in, we found something. A makeshift shelter tucked beneath a ledge of limestone and camouflaged with pine boughs. It had partially caved in from snowfall or time, but the shape of it was unmistakable rectangular frame, fire ring, nearby debris scattered in a wide arc. Inside, we found small tools handmade, dulled with use, a tarp folded beneath a pile of broken branches. And on the far wall, scraped into the base of a leaning tree, 2 sets of initials side by side. DW. He marked it, I said. Miles didn't answer. He crouched beside the trunk and brushed his hand across the carving. Or he wanted someone to remember. We kept going. Just as we were preparing to double back toward the fire ring, we heard something. Not animal. Not wind. The sound of movement. A step deliberate. Maybe 2. We stopped. Waited. It came again. Pine needles shifting under weight. Then silence. Then something else. A whistle. Low. 3 notes. Evenly spaced. Not a bird. Too exact. Too human. I reached for the radio on my vest, but Miles shook his head. He raised his voice, not loud, but enough to carry. This is the Park Service. If you're lost or hurt, we can help you. No answer. Only the faint sound of something farther off. The woods had gone still. No birds, no breeze, just that heavy, pregnant quiet. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. But I could feel it. The same feeling I'd had as a kid walking too far into the woods alone. The sense that someone already knew I was there. Miles motioned to our left. A narrow path had been worn into the brush, barely visible, more a break in the consistency of the undergrowth than a marked trail. I stepped onto it. The soil beneath was soft, recently disturbed. We followed it slowly, sweeping side to side with our lights. After maybe a quarter mile, the trail split. One branch curved upward along the slope. The other dipped toward a pocket of shadow beneath a boulder crusted in moss. We split Miles, taking the high route, me the lower. Radios on volume low. The path I followed narrowed quickly. My boots sank slightly into the loam. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare. Deep. pressed into wet soil that hadn't yet dried. They led straight toward the hollow beneath the boulder. I called it in softly. "Miles, you there?" Static. Then his voice. "Rachel, you need to see this." I doubled back and climbed the ridge toward where he stood. His voice had changed, calm but clipped, focused. He didn't speak when I reached him, just pointed toward the hollow. Inside, ringed by stones, was the faint outline of a long-dead fire. Beside it, a stack of notebooks, their covers hardened by time and weather, tucked beneath bark and pine needles. Behind it, carved into the rock wall, were faces, dozens of them, maybe more. Not realistic, not detailed. Just eyes, sockets, some scratched out, some empty from the start, over and over again. The same faces, slight variations, all of them watching. Miles handed me one of the notebooks. I opened it gently. Inside were fragments, dates, patrol notes, ranger schedules, weather conditions. Names. First names, mostly. But one page caught me. A sketch. Daniel, seated at a fire, his eyes missing, scratched out. I turned to the next page. Blank. The next. A single phrase repeated smaller each time. "You forget the face, but it never forgets you." Over and over. I closed the book and stared at the wall again. There were too many to count. Miles whispered. He was trying to erase them. Or himself, I said. We didn't stay long. The sun was already slipping behind the ridge when we started the hike out. We kept our radios on, but nothing stirred. No sound. No movement. Back at base, we handed the notebooks to the tech team and requested infrared analysis. The ink was faint, mostly charcoal, but under light they found something in the margins. Smaller writing. A phrase near the last few pages. "She's coming. She always comes." My hands went still. I read it again. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I closed the file and sat back. Whoever he was, Michael, or whoever he became, he had known, somehow, that I would come back, that I would return to the hollow. Not for him, but for Daniel, and for the silence that still hadn't finished speaking. The next morning, I returned to the tower alone. I wanted to hear the wind from the ridge, the way it curled around the steel frame and pressed against the windows before rushing down into the trees below. It was how I remembered it from childhood, before Daniel disappeared, before the place became hollowed out by memory. From the upper platform, I could see the lake in full, that deep, impossible blue rimmed in gold from the early light. Miles called around 8 to tell me they'd finished infrared analysis on the last notebook. There was a timeline. Broken entries at first. Daniel's name, his routines, weather notations, but near the final pages, something more. Not words exactly, not full thoughts, just phrases. He cooked alone again. Watches stars, woke up humming, and then, near the bottom of the last page, written harder than the rest, I had to choose. I stayed silent. I don't think either of us knew what that meant yet. Miles mentioned one more line. Scribbled in the corner, faint, barely there. One stays, one sees. I copied it into my own notes and read it again. Then again. After that, I went back to the old cabin. The one we believed had belonged to Clemens originally, before the hillside began taking it back piece by piece. The walls were soft with moss, but a few boards near the entryway had held. I stepped lightly, brushing away pine needles, until I found the floor plank we hadn't checked. It was loose on the end, but stuck halfway through. I pried it up with a multi-tool and reached inside. Wax cloth. Twine. And inside a small reel of magnetic tape sealed tight. It wasn't labeled, just kept dry and hidden like someone wanted it found eventually. We brought it back to base, dug out the old playback deck from the archives, and threaded it through by hand. The sound was poor, static heavy, warped by time. But there was a voice. Male. Low. Measured. It took a few seconds for the words to emerge. He keeps talking in his sleep, keeps saying my name. But he never met me. Silence. The tape hissed. Sometimes I wonder if he sees me. Not out there. In here. Inside the dark part of the fire. Another pause. Then I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. But he ran. He ran into the trees. Then the line that held me. They always run. And she always comes. The tape clicked. Nothing more. I sat still for a long time after that. Then I stood, walked outside, and took the long trail that led back up to the tower. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It was nearly dusk by the time I reached the top again. The shadows were already stretching thin across the lake. I stood at the railing where Don Weaver once claimed he saw the figure through the fog. Now, decades later, I was standing in the same spot looking out over the same basin, waiting to see what he saw. I pulled the unmarked figurine from my pocket, the one we found in the tin-shaped, smoother than the rest, the one we thought might be Daniel. I placed it on the railing facing the trees. "You're not forgotten," I said. And that's when I saw it. Not clearly, just motion. A shape slipping between two moss-covered trunks down along the lower slope. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The radio crackled softly at my side. Miles's voice. "Rachel, you still up there?" I pressed the button slowly. "Yes." I saw something. North slope. It moved. "I'm heading your way. Stay put." But I didn't answer. Because something had changed. It wasn't fear this time. It wasn't threat. It was something else. A pull. A current that didn't push me away but invited me in. I left the tower a few minutes later and followed the ridgeline east down toward where the slope dipped and the trees thickened into shadow. I didn't use my flashlight. I didn't need to. My eyes adjusted to the dark the way they always had out here. I walked slow. Not in a trance, not reckless. Just steady. The same way you follow the sound of water in a dry canyon, or the way deer move before first light. I passed the old grove with the stone circle and the carved post and kept walking. The forest began to shift. Fewer pine, more hardwood. Denser. A trail emerged beneath me, not built, just worn by repetition. I followed it until the ground leveled into a small clearing I had never seen before. In the center was a flat stone, wide and low. On top of it sat a journal, and beside it a photograph. I stepped closer. The photo was of Daniel, but older, maybe 30. His hair was longer, beard coming in, thin, but alive. On the back, written in faded pencil, were 7 words. He let me go. But I never left. Behind me a voice. Dry. Tired. I didn't take him. He stayed. I turned. Slowly. The man standing in the tree line wore a coat I recognized from the background of Daniel's camp photo. His face was sun-darkened. Hair long. Beard gray now. But the scar was still there. "Michael Lantry?" I asked. He didn't nod, but he didn't deny it. He pointed at the journal. He wrote that after I told him everything. Told him what I asked. He stepped closer, not threatening, just present. That the world out there has rules. Pressure. Noise. In here you can forget. He wanted that. I looked down at the photograph again. Is he alive? Michael looked toward the trees. He was. Maybe still is, but not like before. I asked him if Daniel was in the hollow now. He shook his head. He left. But his silence stayed. I didn't ask anything else. I just stood there, breathing in that same quiet that had taken so much. Then I turned back the way I'd come. I left the journal where it was. I didn't touch the photo again. That night I wrote in my own notebook. Just one sentence. He was never taken. He was offered silence, and he chose it. I don't know if I would have made the same choice, but I understood why he did. This wasn't abduction. It wasn't a monster in the woods. It was something more human and more terrifying. Surrender. I left the clearing just before first light. I didn't take the journal, didn't disturb the photograph. It felt like a place meant to be found once and not again. I walked back along the same worn trail, retracing my steps, careful not to leave more of myself behind than necessary. When I reached the ranger station, Miles was already there. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just looked at me, then nodded once and handed me a fresh cup of coffee. We sat in the incident room without turning on the overhead lights. The only sound came from the soft tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak from the building settling into the cold. After a while, I told him everything. The stone altar, the photograph, the man in the trees, Michael Lantry. He listened without interrupting. And when I said Daniel had chosen to stay, that he wasn't taken, Miles didn't question it. He just rubbed his hands over his face and said quietly, "Then what was all of this?" I didn't answer, because part of me still didn't know. Later that morning, I went back through the last of the recovered notebooks. I hadn't noticed it before, but something in the light that day made the handwriting on the final page stand out differently. The charcoal was pressed deeper into the paper, the letters uneven. There were 3 short phrases stacked in a column. 2 fires. 1 went out. 1 moved. I had to choose. It clicked into place then. The sketches, the figurines, the separation of one from the others. He wasn't just recording what happened. He was documenting a kind of reckoning. A decision. I brought the notebook over to the table and compared the handwriting to Daniel's journal entries. Same tilt, same spacing, but something had changed between them, an urgency in the later lines, a pressure behind the strokes. A few hours later, we got word from the lab in Medford. They'd enhanced the background of another photo from Daniel's roll, the same frame with the fire the same night. This time, something different. In the distance behind the tent, a second figure, blurred, much smaller, seated, almost still. It wasn't Michael. It was Daniel, which meant the man in the foreground, the one near the edge of the photo, the one looking into the lens, was someone else. A third figure, unknown. I leaned closer. The posture was wrong, shoulders hunched, left hand gripping something tight, maybe a strap, maybe a tool. His face never turned fully toward the camera. But even without the details, the implication landed hard. Michael had said Daniel stayed, but the camera told a different story. Someone else had been nearby, someone watching both of them. I printed the photo and laid it beside the sketches we'd found carved into the stone near the hollow. The faceless figures, the spirals, the ones with scratched-out eyes. There had always been a second watcher in the woods, maybe even more. That evening, I walked the ridge alone, not toward the tower, but along the trail where Daniel's initials had been carved over and over into the old wooden post. I followed the perimeter we'd logged back in September, past the collapsed traps, past the effigies. Eventually, I reached the place we'd first found the stacked rocks arranged in mirrored pairs. Something new had appeared. Just a few feet from the original formation, another circle of stones had been laid rougher, less symmetrical. In the center, a freshly carved token, wood, still damp. No slash across the face this time, but no features either. Just a blank rounded head, a body shaped like the others, but smaller, cruder, made in haste. I left it where it was. I didn't take a photo. I just stood there until the light faded too far to see clearly. On my way back, I kept thinking about the phrase from the tape, "She always comes." The way it was said, not as a threat, not as a warning, almost like a rule, something constant. I wondered if they'd meant me, or if there had been others before. Women who followed after the silence, who asked too many questions, who walked too far into places meant to stay undisturbed. Miles met me at the ranger station just before closing. He had a file in his hand. Park records, maintenance logs from the early 90s. One stood out, a trail closure request for the fire break path near Bare Needle Hollow, requested by Clemens, filed 2 months after Lantry's last known sighting. The justification, soil instability, risk to hikers, but no landslide had been recorded. No weather event, nothing to justify it. The trail had been sealed off anyway. Quietly, I looked up at Miles. So they knew. He nodded. Someone did. I copied the entry into my own notes and underlined the date. The pattern wasn't accidental. These weren't random vanishings. They had all converged on one thing: a man who had vanished willingly, another who had stayed behind, and a third, possibly more, who had learned the silence was contagious, that it could be passed down or absorbed. I didn't know yet what that meant, but I could feel the direction shifting again. The trail didn't end with Michael. It didn't end with Daniel either. It pointed toward something deeper, something older. I closed my notebook and looked toward the ridge. I wasn't finished. Not yet. The final week before the investigation closed out for winter, I felt myself slipping into a rhythm I couldn't break. Each morning I woke before dawn, brewed the same pot of bitter coffee in the break room, and watched the ridgeline turn from black to gray, then gold as the sun climbed behind the firs. On the surface, the park returned to order. The junior rangers rotated out, and the maintenance crews took down the last of the hazard signs. Even Miles spent more time behind his desk, logging the season's final incident reports, prepping for his own transfer to Idaho come spring. But every time I tried to let go, some small detail would catch like a branch snagging your sleeve on the way down a hill. I went back to the old sites, first alone, then with a deputy from the county who specialized in cold cases. He had questions I couldn't answer, but he understood the logic of the woods. He didn't dismiss the ritual objects, the effigies, or the evidence of lives that threaded in and out of the forest's deep pockets for years. We cataloged the tokens again. 7 carved figurines, 6 marked with a single slash across the face. 1 left unmarked, slightly taller. The wood polished, where it had been held so often, the grain ran smooth under my thumb. The county deputy asked if I believed the unmarked figure was Daniel. I didn't answer, not directly. I told him what Michael Lantry had said and what I'd read in the journals. Sometimes the silence here was something people ran from, and sometimes it was something they ran to. Sometimes the difference only made sense when you were standing in the middle of it. That week, the last results came back from the Medford lab. The fingerprints from the inside cover of the waterlogged notebook matched Daniel's just as we expected. But they also found another set, older, partial, layered over time. Not Clemens's, not Michael's. Unidentified. That meant at least one other person had handled the journal in the years after Daniel vanished. Maybe another lost hiker. Maybe someone who was drawn in for a time and then moved on. Maybe someone who never left. Miles met me outside the station that evening, walking me to my truck as the last light faded. He asked if I would stay at Crater Rim after the season ended. I told him I didn't know. Some places aren't meant for second acts. He smiled at that, said if anyone could outlast the woods, it'd be me. Then he paused, hand on the tailgate, and looked out over the empty parking lot. You think the truth ever really comes out? I shook my head. Not all of it, just the parts we're willing to hear. He nodded once, then walked back to the office, and I listened to the sound of his boots fade into the dark. That night I took the 2 things I had left for Daniel, the unmarked figurine, and the photograph I'd found in the clearing, and drove up to the old fire tower. The road was rutted, the sky low and full of early winter stars. I climbed the stairs slow, every creak familiar. I set the figurine on the rail facing out toward the hollow beside the photograph and just stood there a long time. Below Crater Lake glinted in the moonlight, vast and black and impossible to understand. It would hold its secrets a little longer. Before I left, I wrote a single line in my field log. He wasn't taken. He found quiet. Maybe that's all any of us ever really want. I locked up the tower and started down the stairs. Halfway to the truck, I stopped thinking I heard something, a low whistle, 3 notes carried up the ridge from the pines. I waited, holding my breath. It came again, softer, almost musical, then faded. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe not. I never mentioned it to Miles, never put it in the log. Some things are meant to echo. Some things you just let rest. The official investigation closed with no charges, no suspects, and no missing person recovered. Just an acknowledgement tucked into the last page of the report that the case of Daniel Weller would remain open. But those of us who spent time in that forest knew better. Some mysteries stay rooted where they began. And even now, if you hike out along the northern rim when the sky is just starting to turn, you might hear it too. A call that's not quite human, threading through the timber, a memory carried forward by anyone willing to listen. I left the woods that night, but they never left me. And I knew deep down the story wasn't really finished. Not for Daniel, not for Michael, not for me. The last time I left Crater Rim, the woods were quiet. I paused at the overlook and looked down through the thinning pines past the ridge that had shaped the whole course of my life. Some losses you learn to carry. Some answers never really settle. I kept Daniel's picture in my jacket pocket, the one I'd found in that hidden clearing, the man he could have become, or maybe did become for a while. In the months that followed, life moved on around me. Miles took the job in Idaho, sent postcards now and then, his handwriting always neat, just a line or two about the weather or a memory from the trail. The county closed the files, but they never closed the wound the forest left in us. Sometimes at night I'd sit by the window listening to the wind push through the old fir trees behind my house and think about all the names that had been lost there. Not just Daniel or Michael Lantry or even Clemens before them, but the ones whose stories we'd never quite untangle. I used to believe closure meant finding every answer. Now I know some endings are softer. The truth comes in pieces, a notebook in a ravine, a voice caught on an old tape, initials carved deep into a splintered post. Justice, if you could call it that, was a kind of memory that refused to disappear. I found peace not in solving what happened, but in carrying forward what mattered. I kept going back to the tower, to the fire road, to that rough stone in the hollow where I'd left Daniel's figurine and photo. Each time it felt less like searching and more like keeping watch for those who couldn't come home. In the end, what stayed with me most wasn't fear or even grief. It was a kind of quiet resilience, the knowledge that even when silence wins, love doesn't vanish. Sometimes that's the only justice we get. For those of you who listened all the way through, thank you for letting these names be heard again. If you've known a silence like ours, or if a story like this ever reached into your life, I hope you'll share your thoughts below, or maybe just hold a memory close. It's how we keep the missing from fading. It's how we leave a light on just in case someone finds their way back.